So, looking in as a Canadian onto America, right? This whole phenomenon, I kind of, it fascinates me, but I can't help but think, right? There's still a racial reckoning that needs to be had here, right? Like sometimes I talk with people and they say, well, no, it's actually, we are in a colorblind society, and that can't be entirely true, because if it were, then there wouldn't be this energy in exactly these types of utterances that are taken as moral axioms. Like, there's something that clearly needs to be fixed here still, or am I wrong?
Well, I'm an immigrant. I came here in 1985 at the age of 20, and I moved to the Deep South. I lived in Atlanta for 8 years. In 36 years, I've watched increasingly the improved race relations of this country. I think they have deteriorated a little bit in the past 10 years or so. I'm going to be a little bit radical here and say there is no racial reckoning to be had. There are episodic moments, and there are still episodic incidences of injustice that blacks face. But look, short of a bloated totalitarian state in which you are going to be a hyper-vigilant watchdog over the conscience of people, there will always be racists, or as Shelby Steele said, there will always be stupid people, or what I'd like to call them, psychotic people, because racism is a form of psychosis. It's a misperception of reality. It's misperceiving the person who's standing before you, where you're just judging that person's character based on skin pigmentation or the morphological characteristics that a person possesses. So there is really nothing that you can do to control the thought patterns of a person or the psychotic sensibilities that he or she possesses. All you can really do is, racism is illegal. You can punish that person for a crime if he breaks the law. That is, if he discriminates against another person. I don't think there's any reckoning to be had. And the reckoning that we're talking about is reparations. And in my book, What Do White Americans Owe Black People, I think I do a stellar job of laying out why there can be no such thing as any further reckoning. We've had 3 great foundings in this country where there were moments of reckoning. I don't know what further reckonings would look like short of tearing this country apart and systematically and systemically transgressing and violating the rights of both white Americans and black Americans and turning this country into a charnel house. I think what we have to do is we have to look at those isolated cases where the rights of blacks are violated. If there's still cases of redlining going on in this country, then those belong in courts of law, not as reparative claims at all.
Just very quickly, what is redlining for the benefit of our audience? Yeah.
Well, it's a vast phenomenon. It's when the government deliberate steps through zoning laws, among other things, to deprive blacks from acquiring loans, from living in certain neighborhoods that are typically occupied by whites. There are certain policies that are enacted that prevent blacks from accessing areas of living, of health care, that would render them equal to those of whites.
I see. And I mean, I have seen sort of, I guess, other examples in this vein that we don't necessarily need to jump into here. But I found before I want to talk a little bit about reparations. Of course, it's a big part of your book. But before I go there, are you kind of suggesting that critical race theory, ideology put into practice, education, wokeism in general, praxis, is this actually fostering a kind of psychosis among the people who are being taught this stuff, or taught through the lens of this stuff?
Well, if you unpack critical race theory, which I think is the philosophic foundation, or the philosophic, it's sort of like the philosophic principle that foundationalizes reparations, it is a form of psychosis because, among other things, it's a misperception of reality. One of the main canards of critical race theory is that every single institution is suffused with systematic and systemic racist policies, that racism is endemic to every institution in America, that it is ineradicably endemic to every institution in America. And what I call the third iteration of critical race theory We had the first iteration in the 1970s under Derek Bell. We had the second iteration in the 1990s. And we have a new crop of critical race theorists who claim that white people, just by possessing white skin, are either conscious or implicit or unconscious bearers of oppression. And so they're walking practitioners of systemic racism. That's empirically untenable. It seems to be a form of psychosis because it's based on a misperception of reality. And what the practitioners themselves seem to be after is power. So the reparations advocates and the critical race theory advocates seem to have formed a very unholy alliance. So seemingly disparate groups like Black Lives Matter even, who are not necessarily critical race theorists, find themselves very often in alliance with critical race theorists because Black Lives Matter, the group, advocates the breaking up of U.S. banks, the destruction of the nuclear family. They're Marxist trained. They advocate the breaking up of capitalism. These are all tenets that critical race theory claim are conduits through which what they call race capitalism are propagated. So what we find is that there are a lot of groups that are not necessarily promulgators of critical race theories, but the theory has become so wide and so far-reaching that it functions as a philosophical template for a lot of groups like Black Lives Matter. People who are what we could call woke supremacists find their justification on a critical race theory.
You know, it's fascinating to be thinking about this. There's this whole sort of dimension that you kind of alluded to here that you know, the people that are, I guess, fostering the theories around critical theory, critical race theory, they're actually kind of deeply anti-Western civilization as a whole, right? And I think this is still not something that's broadly known, right? So like there's this question whether the, you know, inherent divisiveness that we've been describing to some extent in our conversation is actually not a side effect, but it's actually by design. Right, and that's what do you think about that?
No, I think it's by design. I think what we have to be very clear, and I make this clear in my book, is that critical race theorists are out to fundamentally change the DNA of this country. They are like critical theorists, from which they gain their philosophic upshot, are out to destroy Western civilization, not just American civilization, but they have waged an assault against Western civilization and the foundations of the Enlightenment, because in some sense they think that all the moral vocabularies and all the cognitive machineries that emanate from the Enlightenment tradition, an objective reality, reason, logic, the scientific method, the concept of universalism and universality, that these are all constructs created by white European imperialists that were used to keep and dominate and keep marginalized people or people on the periphery outside the ambit of the human condition, that they were used to describe characteristics that were exclusive only to one set of people, that is white people. And so we cannot overemphasize the extent to which critical race theorists are out to not just wage an assault against the Western Enlightenment tradition, but they're actually, I think, systemic nihilists in the sense that they want to destroy all those foundational values, all those codified values and principles that we use in times of crisis as what I would call moral inoculants. We inoculate ourselves against those who would attack us from the outside. We use those foundational principles. They want to first erase personal identity, then erase history, erase those codified values to usher in a new, what I would call Marxist, communist agenda in our society.